listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show.
You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show, and I'm your host, Tom Daniel. February 9th, 1964. If you were parked in front of a TV that night, you were probably part of something huge. When the curtain rose, America's living rooms became the front row of a cultural revolution. 73 million Americans tuned their television sets to CBS that night for the Ed Sullivan Show to see four young men from Liverpool make their American debut. We remember how it all sounded, right? I mean, the Beatles screamed, they smiled, an audience swooned, and it was sheer pandemonium. But if you freeze that picture and look past the mop tops and the guitars, there's something else. What most of the viewers never thought to ask was, who designed that set, that space that framed their performance? It was dramatic, geometric, big white arrows pointing inwards. Visually, it sort of contained the chaos. Behind the cameras, behind the shrieks, stood a quiet, meticulous artist named Bill Bohnert, the man who designed and built that stage that first presented the Beatles to America. In this episode of the Tom Daniels Show, we will explore the history behind the headlines and the human craft behind the moments that shaped our culture on that fateful night. I want to talk about Bill Bohnert and the arrows that pointed to the Beatles. That's our focus for this episode, not the music so much, but more of the visual world they stepped into. How did he do it? How did this scenic designer and basically anonymous craftsman create the defining visual for the Beatles' big American moment? And why his choices were so smart from both an engineering and an art perspective. Now, before the television age had celebrities, it had craftsmen, people whose names appeared only briefly in credits, if at all. Bill Bohnert was one of them. He was born in St. Louis and educated in commercial art and scenic design. His father was also a commercial visual designer, and Bill Bohnert was the model for the little Dutch boy on all the Dutch boy paint ads. Remember those? That's Bill. He found his way onto the bustling New York world of live television in the 1950s. And by 1964, Bohnert had joined CBS as one of the art directors for The Ed Sullivan Show, a weekly variety program that broadcast everything from opera singers to performing poodles. The Sullivan stage had to be endlessly transformable, turning over from a Broadway chorus line to a magician's act in just a matter of minutes. Bohnert's job was not simply to build sets. It was to invent a visual shorthand, to take an act that might last 3 minutes and give it a physical identity that television could translate instantly. He worked with what television offered: confined space, limited color palette, black and white broadcast constraints, and the unpredictable alchemy of studio lighting. To succeed in that environment, a designer had to think like both a painter and an engineer. Now, by the early 1960s, The Ed Sullivan Show had become the nation's Sunday night ritual. Bohnert and his small team labored upstairs at CBS Studio 50 on West 53rd Street, drawing and drafting for whichever acts Sullivan's producers booked that week. There were no permanent sets. The stage changed each Sunday like the scenery of a circus. The changes had to be super quick. I mean, you might have an opera singer needing a grand European balcony, and then 90 seconds later, you need a brightly lit storefront for a stand-up comedian, and then following that, performing poodles. So, physically, where did all this stuff fit? Now, the studio space was incredibly tight and packed with set pieces in a confined stage area. Everyone knew they only had minutes, usually less than 2 minutes, to tear down one world and build another. Everything had to be both modular and disposable. So Bohnert had to be more than just an artist. He had to think about logistics, weight, and speed. The two main technical hurdles he faced each week were time and the limits of the existing technology. Remember, this was black and white television, so there was no hiding things with fancy colors. Subtle textures, depth created by shadow, gentle color shifts, and the studio lights back then were harsh. Therefore, you needed bold stuff, high contrast visuals, strong shapes, clean lines. It was like creating a visual shorthand with quick, punchy visuals for a 3-minute act, against the clock, against the space, and against the limits of black and white TV. But few weeks would ever matter more than that first week of February, 1964. According to Ed Sullivan, he and his wife were passing through London on their way home from a European trip, October 31st, 1963. And they discovered that Heathrow Airport in London was in total chaos and disarray, with thousands of screaming teenage fans hanging on the railings, waving signs, and yelling for a band that Ed couldn't quite make out the name. That band had just returned from a tour of Sweden, and Ed asked someone who they're screaming for, and he was told, well, the Beatles. And Ed said, well, then I'd better have them on my show. A few days later, back in New York, Ed Sullivan contacted Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, to explore booking them for the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, Epstein was already trying to crack the American market, and this chance encounter accelerated his efforts. By early November 1963, Epstein flew to New York and met with Sullivan and his producer Bob Precht. They struck a deal around November 11th, 1963, for the Beatles to make 3 consecutive appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964. At that point, the Beatles hadn't released any singles in America yet. No one here had ever heard of them. And by the way, they were paid about $3,500, which was the union scale for a performance fee back then, but the exposure they got was invaluable. Their first American single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, was released on December 26, 1963. Now, it was already a #1 hit in England that week. I Want to Hold Your Hand entered the Billboard Hot 100 on January 18, 1964, and reached #1 in America on February 1st. Wow, lucky for them that Ed Sullivan had already booked them to be on his show right then. When the Beatles arrived in New York on February 7th, the press coverage bordered on hysteria. Photographers swarmed the Pan Am terminal. Teenage girls screamed as if witnessing a coronation. But inside CBS, Bill Bohnert's world remained practical. How to place 4 musicians, their amplifiers, their drum kit, and the famous Sullivan Orchestra all within the same limited time frame. Now, in later years, Bohnert recalled that his goal was to make a simple statement, that the arrows of attention, both literal and figurative, pointed toward this new phenomenon, the Beatles. He designed a backdrop composed of 12 white arrows radiating inward from the edges of a circular frame. In the middle, under that visual convergence, the Beatles would stand. Those arrows were not just decoration. In a medium still limited to monochrome, they created a sense of motion and focus. The eye had no choice but to follow them to the center, to the performers themselves. Now, in a letter decades later, Bill Bohnert wrote, quote, I wanted the audience to understand that these 4 young men were here, that everything led to them. And when the curtain parted at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and Ed Sullivan introduced these youngsters from Liverpool, the television audience saw that graphic geometry before they even saw the band. The arrows glowed in soft contrast to the suits and guitars. It was the first visual American audiences ever associated with the Beatles. A live television in 1964 was a logistical ballet. Each act rehearsed briefly, then waited as stagehands rolled away scenery and swapped microphones. Set designers like Bill Bohnert had to create structures that could be assembled and disassembled in under 2 minutes. The Arrow wall was a modular hard set, painted plywood sections that could be quickly bolted together. To the naked eye in the studio, it may have seemed unremarkable, but on television, under the stark lights of black and white broadcast, those shapes became pure contrast and energy. Television design at the time favored abstraction, strong geometry, clean lines, because detail could vanish in transmission. Bohnert's arrows used that limitation as an advantage. He wasn't imitating the decor of Liverpool clubs or the look of American rock stages. He was creating a visual icon that worked in the grammar of television. His design echoed other visual motifs of the period, the jet age arrows of airline logos, the thrust of modern advertising, the aesthetic of forward motion. Bohnert's design aligned the Beatles with progress itself. They were not an exotic import. They were the arrowhead of something moving forward. As I mentioned, there were 12 big white arrows, stark white, all pointing inward toward the Beatles. And they weren't just decoration, they were functional. They created instant visual motion and focus, as your eye had nowhere else to go but straight to the Beatles. Bohnert said that he wanted the audience to understand that the Beatles were here. Even in the wide shots where the band appears small, the arrows made them the focal point. And arrows were everywhere in the 60s marketing design. They were a really big deal then. Car logos, airlines, electronics. Arrows meant speed, progress, the future, moving forward. It visually presented the Beatles as the future. They were literally framed by the symbol for progress. And also, this was only 11 weeks after the assassination of President Kennedy, and there was a national mood of America's youth looking for renewal, something positive. And then here come these joyous guys, framed by these powerful arrows, and it visually represented a new hope for the future. Now, earlier in the day, the Beatles had rehearsed against a different set backdrop, so even they didn't get to see the final set until the show went live. When Ed Sullivan raised his hand to quiet the crowd and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!" the broadcast cut to that stage. George Harrison had been ill with the flu during rehearsal. One of the stagehands had to stand in to take his place. But by showtime, he was there, standing between Paul and John, with Ringo elevated on a riser behind them. The set made that arrangement look monumental. As they launched into their first song, All My Lovin', the camera panned across the arrows, the lights, the crowd. The space pulsed with the visual rhythm Bohnert had engineered. Even viewers who could not hear the music over the screams could sense the organized chaos of the stage. That image, the arrows pointing inward, the Beatles framed by geometry, became one of the most reproduced television stills of the decade. It appeared in newspapers the next morning, in Life magazine spreads, in a piece of art created by Michel Mangione, and eventually in every documentary about the 60s. But few captions ever credited the man who built it, Bill Bohnert. You're listening to The Tom Daniels Show. We'll be right back.
What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show.
Welcome back to the Tom Daniels Show, and of course, Mary Mac went Merseyside for that music. Awesome. Mary Mac is the world's most perfect band. Now, the Beatles' first broadcast was live from New York. Their second appearance on Ed Sullivan on February 16th came from the Deauville Hotel in Miami Beach. Now, for that performance, CBS used a local production team in Miami, and the set was entirely different. It was a tropical modern design with palm frond patterns built by the Miami affiliate's art department. Bohnert, based in New York, was not part of that broadcast. However, the third show on February 23rd used footage pre-recorded at CBS Studio 50 during the same week as the debut. In those segments, the Arrow backdrop returned, confirming that Bohnert's set was used again for that material. Basically, the Beatles performed two sets that night, February 9th. The first was broadcast live, and the second was taped, and then shown 2 weeks later on February 23rd, long after the Beatles had gone back to England. Thus, of the three February 1964 broadcasts, the first and third definitely bore Bohnert's visual signature. The second, broadcast from Florida, did not. The Beatles only made one more physical appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, and that was in August of 1965. By then, the set design had evolved into more abstract forms, and Bohnert's arrows were gone. But their impact lingered. They recorded 6 songs in front of a studio audience that night in August of 65, and the tape was broken into 2 different appearances by the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, September 65 and then May 66. Ironically, that recording was made the day before their historic appearance at Shea Stadium in New York, and they were introduced at Shea Stadium by, of course, Ed Sullivan. And technically, they appeared one more time on Ed Sullivan in June of 1966 with the worldwide premiere of the first ever music video, Paperback Writer. I love to play trivia, and I hate getting questions about the Beatles because they usually will come in this kind of format. How many appearances did the Beatles make on The Ed Sullivan Show? Well, good grief. Well, technically, 2. They appeared twice on The Ed Sullivan Show. Okay, then 2 of those were broken up into 4 appearances and broadcast 4 different episodes. And then there was the episode from Miami, and then you have to add the one with the music videos in which they didn't actually appear. So 6, what are you looking for? Are you looking for 2? Are you looking for 4? Are you looking for 6? Which correct answer are you looking for? Now, to appreciate Bill Bohnert's work, we have to understand how television treated its visual artists. Art directors on variety shows were both anonymous and indispensable. They worked under relentless schedules, sketching, drafting, building new sets each week. CBS maintained a small army of such designers. Bohnert, Charles King, and others rotated through the studio. They were expected to produce professional scenery for every act, regardless of fame or genre. In interviews later preserved by the Television Academy, Bohnert described the work as organized panic. The designers had to anticipate camera angles, lighting shifts, and costume colors, then translate all that into backdrops that would not distort on camera. Their tools were simple: drafting paper, matte paint, plywood, and an understanding of optics. Their timeline? Often less than 5 days. In that crucible of deadlines, Bohnert's Beatles design stands out not only for its effectiveness, but for its endurance. It wasn't meant to last decades, yet it became one of the most iconic backgrounds in television history. After the broadcast, most Ed Sullivan sets were dismantled, painted over, or just thrown away. Yet a small section of that Arrow wall survived. Bohnert kept it. He kept a fragment of it, a plywood panel that bore the marks of that night's performance. Years later, he obtained autographs from each of the Beatles on that set piece. They each added small caricatures that they drew beside their signatures. In a letter accompanying the relic, Bohnert explained its origin. He said, "This panel formed part of the hard wall behind the Beatles on their first appearance in this country." Now, when that fragment of the set eventually reached auction, it became one of the most valuable artifacts from the show, not because it was signed, but because it was the literal backdrop to a generational event. The letter authenticated the story, giving historians their clearest direct link between Bohnert and that February 9th set. His original sketches for the set are also part of the collection in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum. Design scholars sometimes dismiss television scenery as disposable craft, but Bohnert's work invites a more generous view. His arrows were more than arrows. They were the language of 60s modernism compressed into just a few feet of plywood. In the visual rhetoric of the Cold War, arrows and vectors implied progress, technology, optimism. The same shapes appeared in advertising, architecture, and even furniture. Bohnert was, consciously or not, aligning the Beatles with that aesthetic of modernity. When those arrows pointed inward, they didn't just emphasize the band. They symbolized the convergence of worlds, Britain and America, pop and television, youth culture, mass media. The stage became a visual metaphor for arrival. And arrival was exactly what the moment required. For an American audience still mourning the assassination of President Kennedy, the Beatles' joyous presence on television felt like a renewal. Those inward-pointing arrows framed not only a band, but a national mood turning toward the future. Bohnert continued designing for The Ed Sullivan Show through 1964 and into 1965, creating sets for performers as diverse as the Supremes, the Rolling Stones, and Barbra Streisand. Each required its own style, the clean lines of Motown, the theatrical glamour of Broadway. He remained in the CBS art department until the show's decline in the early 70s, later moving on to other television projects. Yet, no later work equaled the visibility of that single night in 1964. Bill Bohnert also worked on Donnie and Marie, The Brady Bunch Hour, The Electric Company, and America's Funniest Home Videos, plus tons of game shows and TV specials with artists like Perry Como and Richard Pryor, Jerry Seinfeld, etc. When asked years later what he remembered most about the Beatles' performance that night, Bohnert said simply, "It was just another Sunday. None of us knew what was happening until we saw the papers the next morning." That humility reflects how television history often treats its artisans. Their work becomes invisible precisely because it succeeds. The better a set functions, the less the audience notices it. In modern retrospectives, the arrows appear again and again on anniversary specials and documentaries, even as motifs in museum exhibits. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame includes reproductions of Bohnert's sketches among its television archives, recognizing them as part of rock history as much as broadcast design. For the Beatles, that first Sullivan stage became the visual shorthand for their American breakthrough. Every reenactment, every parody, from that 70s show to Super Bowl halftime tributes, recreates those arrows. And every time we see them, whether consciously or not, we're looking at Bill Bohnert's idea that a simple pattern could focus the energy of a cultural explosion. Now, why did I devote an episode of this show to a stage designer few people know by name? Because history often hides the hands that built it. Music historians can tell you which guitars the Beatles used, which microphones captured their sound, but the visual frame, the architecture that carried those images into living rooms, belongs to another discipline altogether: design. Bohnert's arrows are an object lesson in how art direction shapes perception. They prove that even the smallest design decisions can define an entire era. And moreover, his story reminds us that popular culture is collaborative. No single genius creates a revolution. It takes hundreds of quiet craftspeople, designers, lighting operators, cameramen, each adding a piece to the mosaic. Now, standing backstage at Studio 50 that night, Bill Bohnert probably didn't hear much of the music. He would have been focused on whether the lights flared properly, whether the set held steady as the cameras rolled. Yet the structure he built outlived them, outlived the show, even outlived the monochrome television era. Today, when we picture the Beatles' first American performance, we don't see Ed Sullivan or the orchestra pit. We see the four silhouettes framed by those 12 white arrows pointing inward, a graphic symbol of arrival, of youth, of a world turning toward a new sound. That image began on Bill Bohnert's drafting table. And though his name rarely appears in documentaries, His work remains one of the most enduring visual compositions in television history. I can't help but wonder about today, and does modern culture do that as effectively? A thing spread now across so many different platforms and media formats, but is there still that same effort to visually frame significant cultural moments, knowing that the setting and staging could become legendary? What visual shorthand defines today's biggest stars? Now, my thanks for this episode to the archival sources that preserve his legacy, the Washington Post, the CBS Archives, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's design collections, and the private correspondence of Bill Bohnert himself. This has been The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening. Keep learning.
Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Take a break from your usual routine and tune into the Tom Daniels Show. You'll discover the world of melodies and stories that you might not know. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. Keep listening, keep learning. The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom Daniels Show. What are you waiting for? The Tom